1. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. And yeah, we're excited to see everyone here. So, whoops, I have the YouTube stream open on the same. Let me close this real quick so it doesn't get feedback. But yeah, welcome to the Backend Development Workshop. Today, we're going to be learning about the usage of web requests, and web requests are really useful for developing web applications and more. And it's really about being able to get kind of dynamic and updated information when the program is run, not necessarily information that you've hard-coded into, for example, the application or your script when you've written the program or reading from a file. Is kind of more dynamic and up-to-date from the internet. So, there's a lot of things you can do with web requests. Pretty much the entire internet is powered off of web requests for the most part. So, for example, when you're loading up a page, that's a GET request that we'll learn about in a few seconds. When you're listing flights from the nearest airport, for example, when you're making a reservation at a restaurant, when you're getting the weather, all of these things make use of web requests, and we'll be learning more about them and building a small weather getting script using web requests. So to get started, I want to make sure that everyone has two things. Everyone has Python, an IDE for Python, Flask, and the request module. Hopefully you're able to get that installed. If not, you can take some time now to get that installed while I'll go over some other details. So also I want to make sure that everyone has access to this document over here. It has some notes on what we're going to be going through today. And before I forget, I think I should also get the streaming, not the streaming thing, the key for the workshop on screen. So give me 1 second over here. Cool. And I think for this workshop, the points code is this. Let me make this a bit bigger. Let's take a screenshot or something like that. I'll leave it up for another 10 or so seconds before we dive right into the workshop. Cool. Okay, so yeah, I mean, if anyone has not had the code yet, I guess I'll send it in the chat as well for so good question. How do you know if you have Flask installed? If you can import Flask in Python, then you should have it installed. Like here, we'll be going through over this. Like if you can do something like this, then you'll have it installed. Then you'll know you have it installed at least. Okay, so now let's get started with the workshop. So to start things off, let's kind of talk over more about the different types of web requests. So whenever you open a web page or download a file, you're making a web request through a format called HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which I'm sure you've all heard of in some shape or form. And it's essentially a set of rules for how computers can communicate through the internet. And the way it works is that a computer sends a message to another computer, or usually known as a server, and it's asking it for information. And the server returns some information containing details relevant to the request that you sent, or based on the request that you sent. But there's many different types of web requests, and they each perform similar but different roles. For example, not all web requests are made for requesting information or like receiving information. For example, when you're loading a page or downloading a file, sometimes web requests are useful as well for sending information as well. For example, if you're uploading a file or creating a blog post or something similar along those lines. The two kind of most basic web requests, and the ones that we'll be using the most, both kind of in this kind of workshop and in general through your development practices, are GET and POST requests. And GET requests are usually used to load a web page as well. So when you're loading google.com, your browser is sending a GET request to google.com, and it's responding with HTML. And a GET request, like the name GET suggests, is kind of about retrieving or getting information from a website. For example, as I mentioned, when you're loading up a website, when you're downloading a file, or when you're getting the weather, for instance, a lot of these times is using a GET request. And here, actually, let me slide this over as well. This might be helpful so you guys can see what's going on. And so right, I sent the link to this file in the chat as well. Let me make sure. Yeah, I did that. So it might be helpful to follow along, especially later when we start coding up things as well. But essentially, that's the idea behind a GET request. And POST requests are slightly different in the sense that they're usually used to send information. And when you're, for example, submitting a form or logging into a website, you're usually making a post request. Or for example, if you're, creating a blog post or doing something where you're creating something. And when you're kind of like uploading content to a server or API. In addition to get and post requests, there's also a couple more. There's put, head, delete, patch, and options. And, they're quite useful as well. Some of the more major ones I think should be aware of is, for example, options. Options contain some information to the server that you're sending requests to, and sometimes you'll run into cross-origin problems, and options headers are sometimes used to solve those things. So if you Google any of these plus like HTTP, in Google, you'll come up with a lot of useful information on these, but for the most part, they're less commonly used for web development, at least for what we're exploring today. And so the idea over here is that you can get information from a website's kind of public facing area. Like, for example, when you type in like google.com or something into the browser, most applications actually communicate through the use of an API or an application programming interface. And APIs are an interface that is like formatted to be read by a program versus a website that is meant to be rendered and viewed by users. So what do I mean for this? For example, if you're on linkedin.com and you see a feed of users displayed on your screen, right? That is done through the public facing website where you are just loading it up in your browser and it's rendered as HTML with CSS and whatnot. But on the backend side, when you're loading the list of users, most likely it is actually calling an API that returns a list of users in JSON or something, which we'll talk about right up over here. But essentially, it's a more computer-friendly thing versus a user-friendly thing, right? Like if you're, for example, trying to scrape a list of users from LinkedIn, having it as a list of strings would be much more helpful than manually kind of opening up the HTML and getting stuff from that. So let's talk about JSON. So JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation, is a way to kind of format and structure information that is often used in web requests. And it's also used in many other situations, but for now, you can think of it as simply a string way to represent a dictionary. So if you look at this over here, this looks very familiar to anyone who's seen Python. If you're declaring dictionary, this is exactly how you would do it. Like, for example, I can copy paste this over here and say like names equals this, and this would be valid Python, right? But at the same time, it's also JavaScript object notation. And you'll see that they're very similar. So in Python, for example, if I import JSON and I, say json.dumps and I just convert this to JSON, you'll see that if I print it, yeah, it's basically the exact same. So JavaScript object notation, or JSON, and Python dictionaries are really similar. There's a couple of differences, but those kind of come later down the line. But for the most part, they are very, very similar, especially if you're dealing with basic types such as strings and numbers and such things. Okay, so now let's talk about making web requests. So just to pause over here, and yeah, so as I mentioned, you'll be needing two modules. You'll be needing requests and you'll be needing Flask. So now we'll be needing requests. But if you don't have requests, there's another way that you can follow along, and that is using like an HTTP client such as Insomnia or Postman. So you can download one of these things and it lets you kind of make requests outside of a program, just like manually using an application. And yeah, so you can download this as well. This is really helpful for developing things. And as you can see, right, so we can kind of just make requests on here without having to code up things manually. You can just type in a URL, for example, like google.com. You can send a GET request and it'll give you that. It'll give you like, this is the HTML google.com returns. But okay, moving on from over there, right? So for example, there's this really nice service called Postman Echo that I think is by Postman, which is a kind of proprietary version of Insomnia. They basically do similar things, but essentially this is an API that it's called Echo, and it kind of just echoes back what you gave it. So for example, if we were to test this out, just for instance, in an HTTP client like this, right, we would see that it returns this information to us. And let's kind of go more deeply into what's involved over here. So this is a GET request, and you'll see that for the most part, this looks like a standard URL that I'm sure you've all seen before. You got the protocol, the domain name, and the path, right? But what you may not have seen is this question mark and what's behind over here. So these are key value pairs that are sent to the server through the URL. So this is part of a URL, and I think the best way to think about this is, for example, if you make a Google search, like if you just say MasseyHacks in Google and actually, well, okay, 1 second. Let's get this to show the whole URL. Whoops. Let's see where that is. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, okay, this is not fully working, but usually there is a kind of, okay, let's try this again. Or let's, okay. Well, what I was trying to demonstrate was that it usually has the search queries tacked on at the end. So as kind of URL parameters. Let me see if there's a way to demonstrate that. Okay. There we go. Okay, so you can see right over here, for example, that these are some of the parameters passed along with this request. So you'll see it's taking note of the fact that my client is Firefox and Q or my query is MasseyHacks. And this is really useful for passing information. Okay, and you'll see it tacked on way more info over here that's unnecessary. But the idea is that this is a way to specify information in a key value pair, and different things are joined together by this symbol, like the and symbol or the ampersand, and it's used to send information alongside a GET request, usually specifying what you're trying to get, or for instance, in Google search, what we're trying to query the search engine with. So this right here is a GET request to Google with a query of MasseyHacks. And yes, also important over here is that to make note that this is just, right now we're just encoding text. But if you want to send text with special characters, it needs to be encoded in a special format so that it can be read. Now, for instance, if we wanted to search MasseyHacks VIII, you'll see over here that it's encoded this as a plus, but usually sometimes it might be done as %20, which is what a space is, or if this will get out of my way. Okay, it seems Google has changed their format, but essentially if we were to maybe search like something like that, you'll see over here that it's been encoded in a special format, %23 and %24, to specify these special symbols that you don't want interfering with the URL itself, right? Because if for example, if you search slash or something like that, you don't want that to be confused with a slash in the URL. You can't just have it as that directly for that purpose. Okay, now let's jump off over to Python, right? So you'll see over here, okay, well, this almost crashed, but anyways, if we go back to Python over here and we import requests, right? Let's just go over how to use this library. And we want to make a request. For example, we want to make a GET request. So we use the GET method over here, and then we can give it the URL. And then we can print r.text to print the result as text. And you'll see over here that when we make a GET request to the Echo server, it returned us our arguments in the URL as this nice format over here, which you can see that we encoded as foo1 equals bar1 and foo2 equals bar2. Or if it was to be encoded as like a dictionary, it would be having foo1 as a key and bar1 as a value. And so you can also get this. So this is just text right now, and you can, just like do some text stuff in Python, and it's not too useful, right? Because manually processing text is quite difficult. But if you do .json, it treats this as a JSON and converts this to a sorry, this is a really massive B somewhere near me, but yeah, anyways, let's try not to think about that. But you can treat this as a dictionary, for instance. So we want to access the arguments we give it. We can index it just as we would a dictionary. And you'll see over here that what we have this dictionary over here. Now, as mentioned in this document over here, which, by the way, if anyone just joined and doesn't, oh boy, there's a really big B over here. Okay. Yeah, this is like really massive bee just hovering around me. But well, for now, let's okay. Um, okay, cool. It's flown away. But right. So where were we? Right. So, for example, if you wanted to encode this stuff, it wouldn't be fun to encode all of this manually, right? Like say you had like 50 different things, you don't want to manually have to format this. And as I mentioned, sometimes to encode things specially to be URL encoded. For example, if you have any special characters that are not kind of like alphanumerical, you kind of need to do that. So what we can do instead is use the request library to do this for us. So if we have a parameters thing that we pass over here, then it will do this encoding for us. And if we can just replicate what we had over here, like so. And if we print r.json now, you'll see that requests has essentially formatted the parameters we gave it in key value pair and put it alongside the put it inside the URL. And you can see over here that Postman Echo returned to us the URL we queried it with, and you'll see right over here that it's exactly what it was before. We had foo1 equals bar1, foo2 equals bar2. So this is really useful. And just to show what a special character would look like, we can add something like special character is equal to, let's just put a whole bunch. And you can see over here that it's formatted it and returned it to us exactly the way we typed it. But in the URL, it's a string of a whole bunch of % encoded things that you can see would be a big hassle for us to type manually. Now, we can talk about, so that's kind of like the rough idea of a GET request. And we'll be working more closely with the GET request later on the module when we are kind of building like a real application of some kind. But for now, let's move on to talking about post requests. So post requests are about, as I mentioned, sending information over rather than kind of getting information. And one of the biggest things about this is, I think, from a kind of user perspective, is that this, unlike a GET request, is not included in the URL, right? So for example, as we see over here, right, when you send over things as a parameter, it's all stuck on over into the URL. And that is a problem for a couple of reasons. For one is kind of like maybe privacy and security. You don't want, for example, someone's passwords to be stored in their browser history, right? That would be a pretty terrible idea. And at the same time, there's also a length restriction on URLs. So if you were sending something really big, a post request would be able to handle it way better than a URL would be able to, because you don't want to reach up to that limit. So to make this into a post request in Python, it's really simple. You just change get to post, and we'll change the path of this as well. And so to post a request over here, you can use the data argument rather than the parameter. So you can put parameters as well. And if I just do this over here, you'll see that it's kind of put this in args as well, but you'll see that the data and the form sections are empty, which is not what we're looking for. So if we change this over to data, this will send over information as, well, you'll see right over here that the URL is just the URL, right? There is nothing to kind of dangle on over to the URL, which is good for us. And you'll see over here that it is sent over in the forms section right now over here. And that is because by default, this will be sending information as a form. And if we instead wanted to send this as JSON, which is more commonly used, we would just say JSON equals this. And you'll see over here that it's in the data section now, exactly as kind of like the dictionary that we formatted it as. And we can, access the data and say like as JSON equals to this. And we can print as JSON at foo1, which should give us, okay, not the debugger, but it should give us, oh, whoops. Should give us bar1 over here, right? So this is very helpful that is built into Python. And so I would encourage you to play around with this and look at the documentation, and also be wary of, for example, when you're sending information over to an API, of what format it is looking to receive it in, because it could be as JSON over here. So let's go back to printing. Now, it could be looking to receive this data as JSON, or it could also be looking to receive this as form data, which if you do data equals this, then it would be inside the form section. So really make sure to read the documentation, the API you're using, and you'll see over here that the content type over here is application slash xwww form URL encoded. And that leads really well into the header section over here. So when we're sending web requests, as said over here, sometimes you need to send information through what is called the request headers. And the request header is kind of prime the API server in a sense to tell it what to expect in the information that is coming. It contains information about the request that you're sending, some options, authentication, and some other things. So I know it says, I think it says to use Chrome developer tools, but I have Safari and it should be the same idea. So if we go to MasseyHacks.ca, for example, over here, and we open up the developer console, and we go over to network and we look at MasseyHacks.ca. So you'll see that the preview over here is the response it gave us, but there's also a header section. And well, you'll see over here that it's got some of these headers that we were talking about. Some of the more major ones of note is the user agent header. So this is sent along by your browser whenever you make a request, and it will be sent along by requests as well. So if we look over here, there should be, usually there is, but maybe not over here. Yeah, actually it's right over here. Yeah, so you'll see the user agent, and this describes like the piece of software that is making the request. And in this case, it's Python request version 2.26. Or in this case, it is a really long user agent string. And a lot of these are here for historical reasons, but the major one over here is Safari 15.4 over here. And you'll see that there's a couple of other headers as well. For example, the language headers that accepts the kind of the host that it's accessing. And yeah, so these are headers. And there's a nice summary of these over here. And the cookie is also useful as well. And this stores cookies that your browser has stored. And it stores information, like, for example, information about you and to personalize things. They can also be used to track users for advertising purposes and monetization purposes, which is a bit of a problem sometimes, but cookies are quite useful. For example, when you're logging into a website and you have to be remembered so you don't keep getting asked, for example, when I reload this page, right? We don't want to be constantly asked to log in. Okay, now what's more interesting, I think, for us is the content type header. So for the purposes of API development over here, you'll see that there's quite a list of different content types, and depending on the content type, the server will attempt to process things differently. So if we go to the Mozilla developer documentation over here, you'll see that there are a whole massive list of different types, and not all of them will be useful, but the way they're structured is type/subtype. And what you can see over here is, for example, over here we have, for our form data, it has a type of, let's find it over here. Content type. Okay, there's a really big B again. Oh dear. Okay. This is not great, but okay, let's move on. And hope I don't get stung by a bee, because that would not be fun at all. But essentially, it has the content type over here of the data we're sending it, which is, by the way, this is an echo service, so it just returns to us what it received. Now, if we were to format this as JSON, you'll see, for instance, over here that this has now changed its content type to application/JSON. And the application is the main type, it's application data, and the subtype over here is JSON, versus before it was xwww URL encoded. And so we can also set headers manually. And in Python or in requests, you would fill in the headers argument with, again, you'll see that headers are also key value pair. For example, you have content type as the key and applications.json as the value. So we can set headers manually as well. If we just say like my header and we give it a key of my value, you'll see over here that when we send this request, we should now see the my header thing somewhere in here. Okay, let's just, yeah, there we go. It's over here. So you'll see that it's sent in another header item as my header with a key of my value. And this can be useful if you're developing your own backend or front end and you want some special headers to go along to communicate certain things when you're developing an application. So this is something that you can use to, for example, to signify authentication for one, which I think is the next thing that we are going to be talking about. Yeah. And so, right. Headers over here. And yes, another way to access headers is, for example, if we have R, we can also print r.headers. And this is the full list of headers as well. And a cool thing to note about this is that headers are non-case sensitive. So, for example, content type over here can be structured as content type, or, well, if I spell it correctly, content type like this, or content type, or, you know, content type like that. They are usually case insensitive, which means you can structure the capitalization as whatever you want. Now, okay, now let's move on to authentication. So we don't usually want our APIs to be able to be accessible by anyone else. And the APIs you're accessing most definitely will have some sort of authorization or authentication because, for example, if you are running a weather API, which we will be using shortly from AccuWeather, you don't want people to be able to freeload off you. You need some way to make sure that people aren't spamming your API and that people are paying for API access. And one way to do that is by adding authentication over into the API. Now, one type of this is basic authentication. And the way this one works is that it is just a pair of usernames and passwords. So, for example, if we say username and password, of course, in a real API, you would be printing out the you would be filling this out with the actual username and password given to you. But you'll notice you'll notice over here that actually, let me just stop to make sure if there's any questions in the chat. No, okay, great. Well, you notice over here that this is sent over as username and password. And that is one way to kind of do authentication. But another more, I would say probably more commonly used these days is to do a bearer token. And this would be sent in the headers. Now, for example, if we had an API that had a token of like 123 ABC, we would send this over as, let's see. We would send this over as an authorization header, and you'll see that this is kind of legacy, but the authorization, there's an authorization header, but the value over here is bearer space the token. Now this is kind of left over before where there would be other types of tokens, but this is something to keep in mind that it's not just authorization of the token, it's authorization bearer space the actual token, which in this case is token. And if we send over this request, you'll see in the headers over here of that we have authorization bearer followed by the token. And this is often used to access various API services. And now you know that if an API, for example, tells you to put in a bearer token, that this is how you would structure the web request. Okay. Yeah, cool. So now that we've kind of gone over some of the basic stuff, let's get into something more interesting. So we'll be building a weather API. So to be able to get weather from AccuWeather using the developer API for a location that we give a program. So what everyone should do right now is go over to the AccuWeather homepage and follow the instructions that are listed in this document over here. And what you want to do is you want to register a developer account and make sure that when you're creating the product, creating the app as shown, that you pick limited trial and not MinuteCast limited trial, because those two things are different products. But I think for the most part, what you put for the rest of these answers don't really matter. But yeah, essentially you want to register, make an account. It'll ask to verify your information to prevent spam probably. And let's give people a moment to get through this. But once you have an app created and you see something like this, then we can move on. So I'll give everyone 5 minutes or so to do this. We'll circle back at 4:35 to give everyone an opportunity to do this. And it would help if once you're done with this process to maybe type done in the chat or something like that. Yeah, and if anyone has any trouble creating an application on AccuWeather with these details, feel free to let me know. But once you do and you go to My Apps, you should see under Keys API key, which is what we'll be using for our next little half of the workshop. So yeah, I'll give everyone until 4:35 to make this application and get an API key. So I hope everyone has had the chance to um, get the application keys. If not, well, okay, we'll go into the API reference first. So API documentation is always very helpful when you're trying to build an application of any kind. So for the purposes of this application today, what we want to do is we want to be able to have the user enter a location, get them the location that they want, and get the weather forecast for those two things. So just based off of this API reference, two things that we'll be using most likely based on our specification of this product is locations API and the forecast API. So first things first, let's look at the locations API. So assuming we want to get a list of cities, for example, we want to search a list of cities, we can use this API right over here, right? And you'll see that it has two things that it wants, the API key as well as the query, which is the text we want to search for. So now you can use this playground over here and we can, now let me just get the API key right from over here. But for example, if we were to search, Windsor, it would give us a list of cities. And, the one we want is Windsor, Ontario, which is this one that is first in the list. Now, another way you can do this is by, for example, pulling up a API client like Insomnia and using the search, and by pasting the URL and giving it the kind of the URL parameters that we want. And over here is API key with API key and Q with a query. So as you'll see over here, we get Windsor, and we also get a list of a whole bunch of other information, a whole bunch of other cities. Now that we kind of know what the structure of this looks like, we can begin programming this in Python. So let me find, oh, this keeps getting in the way. But okay, cool. So it would probably be helpful to define API key as equal to our API key, and we can say, for example, we can ask the user for what city they want. We can say search city equals to input and this would get us a city. We can we can use that in our search, and we can say, and to make the request, we can say requests.get, and we would use this API URL over here to make the request, and we can now put in the parameters as we mentioned as a key value dictionary pair of the parameters that we need for this API. And the two things that it needs is the API key. So in this instance, you'll see that the authentication for this API is not using a bearer token or basic authentication. It is just an API key parameter that is put in the URL. So we can put the API key as so, and the query parameter, as I mentioned, as search city. Now, if we want the JSON version of this, so we can print city results to kind of do some in-between debugging. And you'll ask me for city, and okay, extra space over there. But for example, we can say Windsor, Ontario, and you'll see that it prints us a list of cities over here. And there's a list, and there's a whole lot of them. Now, what we can do is over here is write something to process this, to be able to kind of give this to a user and ask them which one they want in a more user-friendly way. Now, what we can do is now make a for loop over this, and be able to get the city results at the ith element and be able to print this in an easy to understand way for the user. Now, what we can print is, well, we're going to give the user a list of them, right? Because there's going to be a lot more. For example, okay, maybe this was not the best example, but let's see if we run this and we said just Windsor. Now, there's a whole lot of Windsors in the world, and you'll see that Ontario is one of them. But if we scroll down, there's also Windsor in the United Kingdom, over here where the castle is, which is not the one that we want. So we're going to have to give a list of these. And we can do it as such by printing a list, and we can use a format string to print this in a nicer way. We want I+1 so that it's not starting at 0 for the user, so it's easier to understand. And we can say, and if we go back to the documentation over, you'll see that the localized name is the actual name of the, is like the city name of the place. And we can say at localized, whoops. Now, for instance, this will give us a list of Windsors. But this is not entirely what we want, because we want something more specific to help us understand which Windsor it is, right? Because they're all called Windsor. Now, the next thing we can do is add like a administrative area. So, for example, in Canada, an administrative area would be a province over here, and it would, the ID of that would be ON. So we can say city data at, oh, whoops, administrative area at ID. And this would be slightly better. Now you can see there's Windsor, Ontario, Windsor somewhere else, Windsor, California, Windsor, Colorado, whole bunch of other places. I think this is Victoria in Australia, Queensland, whole bunch of other places. So to make this even more specific, we probably want the country as well. And you'll see over here that country is a thing as well. And we can, for example, use either the localized name, which I think let's do in this case, to be more helpful. And country at what they call it over here, localized name. Now, for example, we type Windsor. Oh, whoops. I don't think I spelled this right. Hang on a second. Well, let's look at that. Okay, hang on. Why is it printing? Oh, whoops. That is why it is doing this. Whoops. There we go. I was wondering why this was happening. There we go. And now if we do Windsor, you'll see that it's very helpfully Windsor, Ontario, Canada, United Kingdom, Jamaica, United States, New Zealand, Ireland, South Africa, a whole bunch of Windsors around the world. And then we want the user to be able to, for example, select the one that they want, and we can do something like int input get. Right, we can get them to enter in this, and we want to subtract 1, so that because we are starting from 0. Cool. And now what we can do is get the location key of this, which you'll see is over here. You can control F for this, but key over here. Oh, it's right over here. Yeah, this is the key of this location that we can give to the weather API to get a forecast from. And we'll say that location key is equal to the city data at the city ID, because it's an array, and this is the array index, at key. And if we print, oh, what is this? About city data can be undefined. Whoops. City results is what we want. Yes. Okay, let's actually. 1 second. The massive B is back again. Oh boy. Okay. This is really annoying, but anyways, let's. Okay, cool. So if we print location key over here, I can say Windsor, and let's say we want the first one, which is Windsor, Ontario, and it'll give us this, which is exactly what we want. Cool. Now let's look at the forecast API to get the forecast. And we just want 1 day of forecast. And if we look over here, the parameters of this is that we have this in the URL. So this is another aspect of GET requests. Sometimes things are not encoded as part of the URL as a parameter, but sometimes they're part of the URL as a path, as you can see over here, which is the location key as a path. So you can kind of think of it as getting a specific item. These may or may not correspond to actual file system paths, but you can think of this as a hierarchy, right? So we're getting forecasts from version 1 of the API in the daily category, 1 day, and the more specific one is the 1 day forecast for this location. So we can forecast this. We can copy and paste this as well, and we can say forecast request.get, use an F string again, and then over here we'll put in the location key, and we need to give it our parameters again. And you'll see over here that the only parameter this one really requires is the API key. And we can copy paste this one over here, but after consulting the documentation, you also see that there's a Boolean metric thing for whether we want metric values. And we do want metric values, at least I do. So we can give it the metric equals true thing to get like Celsius versus Fahrenheit. So this is why consulting API documentation is really useful, because it teaches you things about the API that you might not have known just by quickly glancing at it. Cool. So we want this as JSON again, and if we now print the forecast. Now let's be more specific so it doesn't give us a whole bunch. All right, and you'll see that this is the forecast information over here. Cool. And so if we wanted, for example, to browse this, our thing over here, to be able to look at the API more easily, and this is 1183, you can say API key is equal to right. This lets us look at the forecast in an easier to understand format over here, right? This is more helpful than just browsing the output as one massive line in an IDE, but now this is formatted as JSON. And well, let's look at the things that we potentially might want over here. And so, yeah, you see there's text over here, and there is, temperature minimum, temperature values, and yeah, so you see over here that it's given all the units in Fahrenheit. But if I set metric over here to true, this will now be in Celsius, which is exactly what we wanted. Cool. So now let's put this inside our forecast. So if we look inside our document, sorry, my workshop guide, we'll be using the day icon phrase, which is partly sunny, the minimum temperature over here, which is -9 Celsius. And so if we just print this instead, okay. If we just copy and paste that, I think I renamed one of the variables, but cool. Now, if we do this instead, we'll be able to get the weather. Whoops. Okay. Let's look it over here. Let's see what's up. So sometimes you do get a bug or two, and we can print forecast to see why this one is not working. Oh, yeah, whoops. So let's just do this. You can see over here that, yeah, so daily forecasts. So now this should work. or not. Let me 1 second. Oh yeah, whoops. So actually you'll see over here the daily forecast is an array. Now, because you can get multiple day forecasts, we're only getting one. There's only 1 day forecast, as you'll see over here. So we just get this at 0, which should finally get us the forecast. So it's Wednesday right now. Today will be partly sunny with a minimum of minus 1.9 degrees. Now I have no idea if that is correct or not because I'm not in Windsor right now, but you can try for Durham, North Carolina, and well, I hope there's no thunderstorms, but 15.3 degrees sounds about right for a minimum this morning. Okay, cool. So this is roughly, for example, how to construct a script that leverages kind of 2 APIs, blends their information together, and gives some useful output to the user. Now, let's talk about how we can do some more backend development versus just writing a script and be able to create our own APIs. So to do this, that's why I had everyone install Flask. And we can, well, let's make another file for our Flask server. Oh, and so we can start off by, this is just some boilerplate for Flask that you kind of need. That you need for Flask, usually. Cool, and so this is kind of a simple hello world program. And as you can see, the kind of autocomplete for Python, very helpful. And oh. And if we run this file now, we will see that it launches a Flask server. Now, if we open this in Firefox, for instance, you'll see that it prints hello world. And this is basically the start of our own little API. And by default, for these routes, it defaults to a GET request. So our browser is making a GET request to this right over here. Oh, there we go. You can see it's a GET request with what we would expect over here. Now, we can also get this to return HTML. And if we do something like this, if I did the brackets correctly, our browser would try and interpret this as HTML. And you'll see if we inspect element over here, although we didn't give it body and HTML, it kind of interpreted this on its own to construct the HTML, and it made this text bold. Now, this is pretty cool, but since we're slightly running short on time, let's just dive right into something more useful. So like say hypothetically we want to get a program to be able to return information about the architecture of the server or kind of computer the program is running on. We use the Python platform module and be able to construct a root called /computer_info and whoops. Computer info, for instance, and we can get this information. So now, before we go further, just to actually let's ignore this for now. But so the way this Flask works is you have methods that respond to functions, and sorry, yes, you have methods that respond to paths, and the way you specify which method belongs to which path is by using the app.root function decorator. So this basically is a wrapper around getComputerInfo that says for any incoming requests that have the path /computer_info, it will use this function to respond with. And to respond to the function, you just return a value. Cool. So now let's demonstrate how to get information from the request. For example, let's say we want to get one of these URL parameters that we talked about in earlier, right? One of these URL parameters. Now you can also import from Flask the request module, and this lets us get things from the request that's coming in. Now, one of the things that are useful is getting arguments. And for example, let's say we want to get the attribute argument, which is used for platform. And I guess just maybe to demonstrate, we can. I'll demonstrate what this does. what did I say was platform that you name. Right, so if we run this over here, you'll see that we get a kind of dictionary of various things, the name of the system, the version of the kernel, and the machine architecture. And these each have attributes that, for example, we want an API to be able to query. So if we go over here into our Flask server, and so we get the URL parameter attribute, and we want to return a JSON. We can use the JSONify thing over here, and we can return result. This is a get attribute function that gets an attribute from, so this is a named tuple, which is a bit more complicated than we need to discuss. So basically, you kind of think of it as a hybrid between a dictionary and a tuple, but do platform uname and get the attribute. Cool. So stop complaining. Now we run this server over here, and we go to here. You'll see that it still has hello world, but if we go to /computer_info, as I've done this before, and if we don't give it any URL parameters, it will have a 500 error, right? It will crash because it was expecting us to be able to get this attribute. But if instead we do attribute equals node, for example, this gets the name of my computer, which is this string over here, or if we want to get the some other thing from what we had earlier, which let's just run again for our benefit. Right, so if we wanted to get, for instance, the version, we can set this URL parameter to version, and it will get us this result. Cool, so that is how to kind of get URL parameters from a GET request. And what you can also do is make a POST request. And so as I mentioned, by default, the app.routes are GET requests, but you can change this to be a POST request by setting the methods as an array with POST. And now we can have a function that responds to this. And what we would instead do is, for example, if this accepted form data, we could say return request dot form dot get and name. Now what this would do is it would accept form data on that path. So if we make another, if we just use my request over here, and so we know that our server runs on 127.0.0.1 on port 5000/form accept, right? And this would be a POST request. Now, if we send POST right now, it will crash because did not return a valid response because we wanted it to be able to have the name element. Now, so we go over here and we go into the body section and we can say this is form. And if we say name is James, for instance, it'll return us James. And this is form data. And you can see there's many different ways of structuring things. It can be JSON, it can be XML, YAML, or a binary file. And these are all different ways that you can kind of change the way your function accepts different things. And you can, there's request.json, for instance. If we do this, yeah. Cool. And if we do, so now it's that it's JSON, we can send over some JSON. Exactly. And you'll see it's responding with the JSON that we sent instead, because it's determining this to be, because we're asking for the body to be processed as a JSON. And we're also sending it with content type applications as JSON, which is what lets it interpret this string as JSON. Now, if we were to take this out, for example, it would not be able to detect it because we didn't specify that the application type was JSON. Cool. And now, so I think we went over everything I wanted to go over for this workshop. But one last thing, as an exercise that I think everyone should be able to do is to try integrating our original kind of weather script that we had over here. oh, whoops, with an API server. So before, when we were reading in the city that they want to live in, sorry, not live in, the city they want the weather for from user input, try making an API to service to be able to get the list of cities that they want to be able to read this from, for example, a GET request, and to be able to return them the weather. Now, instead of having them enter the number corresponding to the city, what you can do is just always take the first result, which should be the best match. And I think this is a fun exercise for you to confirm your understanding of what we've learned through today. Cool. Oh, and I think this should be wrapped JSON, but to be valid JSON. And yeah, so maybe to demonstrate that part again. But if we're just getting information, do is we can say, oh, what is it again? Right, so this would be application/JSON, because we call the JSON apply method on it. But yeah, again, so that was everything I wanted to go through today. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to message me on Discord or make a post somewhere in Discord, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. But hope you guys were able to learn some basics of backend web development using Flask, Python requests, and reading through API documentation, and using something like a HTTP client to be able to use that in your development process as well. And again, thank you for everyone for coming. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. But other than that, I think this is the end of the workshop. Thank you everyone for coming.